Hi, welcome back. The objective of this video is to discuss how to implement if statements in LabVIEW. And I have on screen right now a typical if statement that you might see in MATLAB, where I assign the variable x to the value 1. And then I'm going to check what is x equal to. If x is equal to 1, I want you to do this thing. If x is equal to 2, I want you to do this other thing. And we want to learn how to actually accomplish this in LabVIEW, this type of idea. And in LabVIEW, they're not called if statements, they are called case structures. So let's go ahead and begin to look at how to implement something like this in LabVIEW. And I'll bring this back on screen later. But for now, let's look at our LabVIEW. We have our front panel and our block diagram on the right. If I right click in the block diagram, all of our typical coding logic things are under structures. So we talked about while loops already. And now you have this thing called a case structure, which is essentially our if statement. So if I click this and then make a box, we see that this is how the case structure looks. Now let's talk about some of the details here. So by default, you'll see that we have the word true listed at the top. And if I were to click this drop-down menu, you see different options. You see true and you see false. And just for the sake of showing things, I'm going to create, let's just say, a numeric indicator. And I'm going to call this number 1. And I'm just going to create a constant here, and I'll just call it 12. Now, if you look, I have these arrows on the right of this case structure where I can go to the false case. And you see when I do that, there's nothing here. If I go back to true, that thing that I just created with the number 1 is present. And the way that this works is that each of these different panes or panels of this structure or options, you see I can switch between them, are what happens inside your if statement. So in this situation, I have actual numbers, but let's say I just do this, which from a MATLAB perspective doesn't really make sense. But from a conceptual perspective, what I want you to see is that if it's true, do something. If it's false, do something else. And that's what this is showing here. If whatever we're checking is true, run this code. If it's false, run this code. So maybe what I'll do is I will create another numeric indicator, and I'll call this number 2. And I will create a constant, and let's say I call this 43. I don't know. So we see that we have these two panels that I'm switching between. And what the code is going to do is look at something and determine if that value is true or false. And if it's true, it'll run this. If it is false, it'll run this. Now, what do we check and how do we check it? Well, if you look on the left, you see this little question mark over here. This is known as the case selector. If I were to wire something to this, it will, the reading of whatever we're wiring it to, it will determine which of these cases we're in. So for example, let's say I come here and I create a control, which we talked about as being something that we can mess with in our front panel. I'll make this a little bit bigger. And basically, if I have the button suppressed, that means that this input here will be true. If I have the button off, like in this case, where it's not suppressed, then this input will be a false value to this question mark. Now, depending on how this button is clicked, that'll determine which one of these codes we run. So for example, let's say I do turn it on. I'm not running anything now. I'm just kind of prepping for it, meaning this is true. If it's true, we'll see that 12 will be assigned to the number 1, and we'll see this change to a 12. This 43 becoming number 2 won't happen because that only occurs in the case where the input is false. And in this situation, we see that it's true because I clicked the button. So if I run this, you'll see that number 1 has changed to 12. Number 2 hasn't changed at all because of the fact that we're only selecting one of these options. And in this situation, I selected true. I'm going to write this back at 0 just to kind of refresh it. because we don't account for that in our code. And now I'm going to unsuppress it. And if I click, if you watch number 2, we're going to see that that changes to 43 because this is determining which one of these cases is running. That's how this works. And if we were to go ahead and do Control H to see our help menu and look at what the case structure is, let's go ahead and look at detailed help. It says contains one or more subdiagrams or cases, exactly one of which executes when the structure executes itself. So if you think about MATLAB, if you have if, else if, else if, else if, else, or something along those lines, it will only execute one of them. So based on what our input is, it will run one of the options that are inside of this little drop-down menu here. I help. Okay, we'll come back to this. I'm going to keep reading it. So you see that you have some input. In this situation, it's a numeric input. What I've been looking at is a Boolean input. We'll change that in a second. And then you have at the top the labels, which determine what the range of values you're testing are. With the Boolean, it's either true or false, so we only have 2 options. We'll change in a second to a numeric input that we'll check. And then inside is what we'll actually execute. That is the area that will run. So it contains the code that executes when the value wired to the selector, this question mark, matches that value that appears in the label. So if this is true, then this panel will run true. If this is false, then this panel will run false. And that's the idea behind this conceptually. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete this. I'm going to delete all this stuff. Starting back. And you see that I can't even run this right now because it has nothing to check. If you look, it says the case structure must have a Boolean or some input wired to the question mark because it needs to test something. If it doesn't know what to test, it can't make a decision. So let's say I wanted to instead have it set up kind of like I had in this area over here, where I'm going to go ahead and check the value of a variable x. So I'm going to create over here a numerical control. This is basically defining my variable, and I will call this x. And I'm going to check what the value of x is. So I'm going to come in, and I'm going to wire that directly to here. And you'll see that as soon as I did that, I'll undo it so you can look. If you look at this true, this is expecting the Boolean. As soon as I wire in a numeric, it changes to an actual numerical value. And if I click this, you see that there's a 0 that says default. We'll talk about what that word means in a second. And then a 1. Now, in my little code that I have over here, the values I'm testing are 1 and 2. So I need to make sure that I have 2 as one of my labels in this drop-down menu. To include that 2, I'm going to right-click this, and you can see I have the ability to add cases. So let's say I click Add Case, and as soon as I did that, it actually added a 2 to this. It created that extra panel. If I do a drop-down, you'll see that it's present. I can change this to any number I want just by typing in it. But we're going to stick with 1 or 2. And in this situation, I have if x is equal to 1, this variable y will become 100. So let me go ahead and create, under the case where x is equal to 1, let's create a, we'll come to the front panel and do a numerical indicator. I'm going to call this y. I'll create a constant. I'm going to call this 100. And in this situation, for the time being, I'm going to make another indicator. Let's just call it y2. We'll explain how to actually get it to be the same y later. But what we'll say is that if that x is equal to 1, we're going to make that y value equal to 200. Again, let's look over here. Really what I'm doing is this, based on the way that I coded it. If x is 1, make y 100. If x is 2, make y2 equal to 200. Let's go ahead and refresh. So we see that our options here, 0 default, we've left blank. We don't really know what that means yet. But if this x is equal to 1, we'll assign 100 to the variable y. And if x is equal to 2, we'll assign 200 to y2. So let's go ahead and make x equal to 1 over here. And if I run this, you'll see that we will end up having this value turn to 100. That's exactly what that just showed. Now, if I do x equals 2, it'll be 200, because that is going to control or determine which of these decisions it's going to make. If it's 2, we end up changing y2 to 200. Now, what does this 0 default mean? Well, if I have this as my MATLAB code, this if statement will only execute in a certain way if x is either equal to 1 or 2. It has to be one of the two to get any meaningful result. In the case where it's not 1 or 2, we usually include an else statement, where we'll say some other thing occurs. And in MATLAB, we don't include no condition. No specific condition is being tested in MATLAB when you have an else statement. That is what the default is doing. So default is basically the else of an if statement. So let's go ahead and create another numeric indicator. I will call this y3. And I will wire a constant to it, and I'll just say it's 300. It changes back to 0. So now I have this case structure written out where if it is a 1, it'll be 100. If it is a 2, that variable y2 will be 200. If it's anything else, y3 will be 300. So let's say I do this random number and I click go, you see that the y3 has changed to 300. That's what the word default means. It's basically the default option if none of these other options in the window are happening or are true. So if I make this a 1, you'll see that this y becomes 100 because of this. An important thing to note is that this y3 did not set back to 0. The code does not show that right now. We'll talk about that in our next video. But that's a general idea. Now, the last thing I want to talk about besides numeric indicators, and I'm going to go through all these cases now and delete them all, is let's say I want to have options that are numbers like 0, 1, or 2, but you categorize them in a different way. You label them using a word, for example. This is what we call an enum. So an enum is, let's say, categories tied to numbers. And let me show you an example. Let's say I right-click here, and I go to numeric. You'll see that there's this thing called an enum constant. If I go ahead and place that, you'll see this little box shows up. And if I click this, we have a drop-down menu. I can add categories to this that will be related to numbers. So let's say I right-click this, and I'm going to click Edit Items. And you'll see that I have the ability to add a list of things to this. Let me just say apples, carrots, bananas. Now, if you look, even though I'm calling something apples, carrots, or bananas, they secretly have values behind the scenes. And those values are what the case structure is testing. I'm going to click OK. You can see if I click this drop-down menu now, I can see these 3 options, and I can wire that into here. And when I do that, you'll see that we have these 3 cases that are now present: apples, carrots, and bananas. So depending on what you're doing, it may be useful to, instead of using arbitrary numbers like 0, 1, or 2, maybe you have categories that are easier to understand for the user or for the person reading your block diagram or your code. But this is another way to set up a case structure. There are other ways of doing it too, with strings or general matrices and things like that, I'm pretty sure. But we're not going to discuss those. I just want you to understand, for the purposes of our class, the idea of a case structure and how you determine what is happening. In the next video, we'll see some more of case structures. We'll talk about shift registers, and we'll talk about how to implement something like this with a while loop as well. So please let me know if you have any questions. Please comment or message me, and I'll be happy to answer them. Okay, thanks, guys.